Shawn Robbins is a writer and chief analyst at BoxOffice Pro. He joins us now from Nashville, Tennessee. Shawn, great to have you on the program with us. In back-to-back weekends, the domestic box office there in the U.S. set pandemic-era ticket sales records. What does that say to you about people's appetite or comfort level with going back to movie theaters?
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I think it says a lot. I mean, we're still in a recovery process. That's the thing we can't forget here. We're not going to be back at normal for a little while. But the appetite to go back out to movies is there just like it's there to go back out to concerts, to restaurants, to sporting events. Movies are in that same group of out-of-home experiences that people haven't had for the last year, and it's not as if they were given up by choice. It was by necessity. So this is still going to take some time, but I think this past Memorial Day weekend and the last few weeks, the last few months in general, particularly in North America and a few other countries that have been able to reopen, have shown some positive signs for the movie industry.
I personally cannot wait to get back to a movie theater, but during the pandemic, we saw more streaming service options than ever before. And do you think that people have gotten used to that and that will take away from some of the theaters as they reopen?
You know, it's tough to say. We've seen numerous competitors towards the theater industry for a century now, or so-called competitors, I should say. First it was television, then VHS, and all the way up to even video games for the last few decades. I think streaming is ultimately a more direct competitor to at-home entertainment than it is out-of-home entertainment. Now, that's not to say we're not seeing some changes in how studios distribute their content. I think that's absolutely worth considering. The main effect will be the shorter windows that theaters have for some movies. But we're also talking about an industry now that makes the bulk of its money from releases during the early weeks. So for some of the real reliable titles that generate most of the box office, those shorter windows shouldn't technically have as much of an impact. But this is part of the evolution and adaptation that the industry now faces, and it's something it's coped with for decades. And now we're going to see what happens, and I think that's going to transition into a lot more event cinema, a lot more premium screens, and just making sure that that experience separates itself from what people, everyday people like myself and like all of us, can enjoy at home.
Yeah, and I'm wondering because I know a lot of movie theaters did close permanently during these lockdowns. I mean, after all, what business can survive being shut for 6 months, at a time? But how long do you think it will take for movie theaters to rebound? And do you think that we'll ever get to the level where we were before the pandemic?
Well, that's the $11 billion question, and I've probably said that too many times, but it's the truth because we're going typically when we look at box office trends, we look at history, we look at comparables, and there's no blueprint. There's nothing to really look back on and say this is how we recovered from a previous crisis, and this is how long it will take to get back to those levels. I think it's going to come down to how studios and theaters both treat this, how more amenities, upgrades, innovations, and content. The positive side potentially is that with shorter windows, that can translate to studios putting out more content to theaters. Perhaps we'll start seeing some of those streaming movies actually go into theaters, which had been a very contentious debate for years prior to the pandemic. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes. We already have seen a lot of changes. And there's no really set timeline. The only expectation for the past year has been that it will take some time. It won't be overnight. So far, that's playing out. And at times, we've even seen some over performances from films at the box office. So I think all of that leads to some positivity, even amid all the uncertainty.
Mhm. When you talk about movie theaters having to adapt to people's changing habits, what are some ways that they can change to make people feel more comfortable? People who might be a little more hesitant to come to a crowded movie theater. One thing that came to my mind is going. I know in America there are more higher end movie theaters that have, say, only half a dozen seats in the theater, and then you pay a lot more for the ticket price, certainly, but it's a more feels a little like a more of an exclusive experience.
Right, and I think that's one example of several. IMAX is a global brand, a global event type of presentation for movie going. I think they will continue to expand. They've been one of the strong points throughout the pandemic because of the size of their auditoriums and the allowance for social distancing. As that kind of falls out, as we get into the late stages of the pandemic and eventually post-pandemic in the next year or two ahead, barring things don't, go back in any way. It's always tough to predict, but I think it's innovations like that, amenities, dine-in seating, We're looking at things like crossover content, things that aren't necessarily movies, concerts, video gaming events, parties. I think the private watch parties from the pandemic are something that will probably continue even onward, because it's another part of the social experience that you get from going to movie theater. It's not just about sitting at home by yourself. It's about going out with family and friends and even sharing that experience with strangers. There's something very unique about that when the right movie and the right experience comes along. And as long as exhibitors continue to lean into that and adapt, I think the health of the industry is ongoing as it wants to be.
All right, and it is certainly a great sign to see movie theaters opening back up again. Thanks so much, Shawn Robbins.